Hey everyone, it's Myriam and welcome to my long-awaited, very late inking tutorial. So this is based on my Inktober drawings, so I wanted to do a little disclaimer before I got into the video proper. Before my Inktober's in 2017, I had never used hatching and cross-hatching, or at least not as purposefully and consciously. So one of my aims for Inktober 2017 was to explore a technique I had never used before. And as I wanted to stick to black and white, cross-hatching seemed like the best contender. So I'm going to show you how I went by it, how I achieved the results I got in my Inktober drawings, and I'm going to share with you what I learned and also what I would have done differently. But please bear in mind that I'm very new at this technique and did not look up any information on it before I used it, so all I will be showing you in this video will be my own opinions, deduced from my own trial and errors. And also please remember that due to the nature of Inktober and how complex my drawings were for it, I didn't have a lot of time per drawing, meaning that I wasn't able to be too finicky and as precise as I would have liked to at times. And what I will be showing you in this video are the basic concept and techniques that I used, but I wasn't necessarily able to perform as perfectly as possible because I lacked the time. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the materials that you can use. I'm going to start off by talking about the ones I used for my Inktobers and why I decided to use them, and then I'll go on to a few alternatives. So the ones I used were Fineliners, Staedtler Fineliners to be precise, in a variety of sizes and nibs. I started off thinking that I might use probably the whole range, and obviously, like most things, I ended up using about 3 or 4 favourite ones in every single one of my drawings. I'd recommend them. They lasted pretty much the whole month. They are now a little bit dead, but they were pretty good, and they lived much longer than I was expecting them to. There are plenty of other brands of fineliners out there that do just as well. I have here some Microns and some Mitsubishi fineliners. I didn't use them in my Inktobers, but I could very well have. I just found the ones I preferred very quickly, very early on, so I didn't kind of expand to my whole range, but any kind of brand of fineliners works really. Alternatively, or in combination with fineliners, you can also use brush pens, which I used more in my previous Inktobers and not so much in this year's, but I'm planning on using them a bit more this coming year and in the next Inktober also, because I really like using them for various reasons that I'll explain later on. You can also use ink dip pens. They are a favourite of people to ink, I think, because they have a particular feature to them that make them really convenient for inking and create really nice effects. And obviously, if you want to use ink dip pens, you need to use some ink for dipping in. I actually used some ink in my Inktobers for the really dark backgrounds. Whenever I painted the backgrounds dark, it was usually some black India ink that I used for that. So mine isn't a particularly great quality, but it still did its job pretty well. Now, quickly talk about the type of paper that I prefer to use for inking. In my Inktobers, I used some cold pressed watercolour paper, some quite cheap cold pressed watercolour paper. I actually didn't like it very much, but it did its job. But I think in hindsight, I probably would have used a paper that was smoother and gave me a bit more control over my lines, because the problem with cold pressed watercolour paper is obviously it's designed to absorb ink, absorb water, but it's also granulated on the surface. It's got a texture, and that texture, when you work especially with fine liners, or when you need to have really good control of your lines, can come in the way and you can become wobbly, or it's also quite a hard paper to draw on with a nib. It's quite a lot of strain on your wrist because it doesn't glide on the paper very easily. So if you had a choice, I would recommend using a much smoother paper than watercolour cold press paper, preferably with hardly any tooth to it, and the tooth is the texture that you can find on the paper. So being right-handed, the easiest movement for me to make is this one, from left to right at a slight upwards angle. Any other direction kind of feels odd and unnatural, and it not only affects my control over my line, which is important with this technique, but also my hand itself. So I make sure to rotate my paper to avoid using my hand in too many unnatural directions and retain as much control over my lines as possible. Obviously, this movement is not necessarily the best one for everyone, so just make sure that you figure out what feels best for you in the long run. So next, I'm going to talk about the technique proper. Something you might have noticed is that I make a conscious effort to use separate parallel, more or less, lines. I purposefully try not to give in to the urge to do a zigzag line, which after you've been hatching for a while feels really enticing because it feels easier and quicker. And the main reason behind that is that even when using Fineliners, line thickness is a big part of hatching and cross-hatching. From what I've noticed, the line tends to be thicker and harsher when you start your movement and tends to have this more feathery, finer look once you lift your hand off the paper. Using parallel lines means you have more control over the final look of your hatching. It means that you can follow the volume of the piece of the object that you're drawing. I'll demonstrate that a little bit more later. And it also means that you have more control over the transition from light to dark, but over the look of your shadows, over the kind of contrast that you want to achieve. And that's just not something you have when you use a zigzag line. A zigzag line tends to have thicker edges on both sides, but generally an even line thickness, and it just looks a bit more messy to the eye, less structured. And it just doesn't organise the shadow quite as well as parallel line does on your drawing. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my technique for shading with hatching and cross-hatching. Hatching can be used to define two things in a drawing, tone and form. And the thing I learned throughout doing my Inktobers was to put down a first lightish layer of hatching to mark out my shadows and put down some kind of basic value. And I would usually make sure to put down my base layer in directions that would make sense with the shape and volume of my drawing subject and would help express the form as well as the basic values of my drawing. When it comes to putting down the second layer, the cross-hatching layer, you have different options. You can go straight up with perpendicular lines, or you can use subtler angles to make the shadows more or less pronounced. The first technique gives, in my opinion, a flatter look to the hatching, which isn't to say it isn't a good or valid look if you choose to go for that, obviously. But because I am showing you how I went by drawing my Inktobers, I won't be talking about it as much as the second technique. I accentuated the darkness of the shadows by not only using several layers of hatching, but also varying the spaces between my hatching lines. I want to hit a little bit on the subject of transition. Depending on the effect you want to achieve, as well as your style, you might want to create a specific type of transition between your darks and your lights. Here are the techniques that I personally used. So for smooth, low contrast transitions, I took advantage of that movement I spoke of earlier. That's for that technique in particular, that's when line thickness becomes really useful. You can use the way the line feathers at the end of the flick to create a smooth, subtle transition from dark to light. And inversely, to create a harsh line of contrast between your shadows and light, you can use your line in the opposite way. It can take some practice to get used to ending your lines in approximately the same place every time. What I sometimes did was draw a limit line with pencil and aim to not go beyond that line, and it kind of gave my eye somewhere to focus on to stop my lines, if that makes sense. Sometimes I even like to leave the line or go over it with my pen for added contrast and dramatic effect. An effect I quite like to use, and that's even for my colour work, is for particularly dark and harsh shadows. I like to up the contrast with those areas and lighter areas by making those darker areas look flat. I find that by not adding too much detail to an area that's supposed to be quite deeply in shadow, it makes the areas that are more detailed and more in the light stand out more. And to achieve that, I use two different ways. I either put down a layer of parallel lines like I'm doing now without following the shape and form of the area that I'm hatching over. So there, for example, I'm not following the line of the cheek. I'm just making it look flat by using just one layer of parallel lines, and I add contrast by using this contour line that I spoke about. Or I can also do the perpendicular line on top to add some depth to the shadow also. And before I finish this video, I wanted to quickly talk about cross-hatching and texture. And the reason I want to touch on that topic is because there are a couple of instances with my Inktober work where I used cross-hatching to convey texture on elements that weren't skin, so texture that was a bit more complicated than skin texture might be. And I needed to do that in conjunction with shadow, basically. And what I mean by that is that as opposed to when using colour, where you have the luxury to be able to use both colour and value to translate volume and texture and shadow to the page, when you crosshatch, you only have crosshatching. So you need to show texture by using light and dark, and by using exactly how the light reflects on the object. So you can't fall back on colour, you just have to analyse how the shadows are working to make all your light play and all your texture play happen. And the way I found to achieve that perception of a different texture is to add some randomness to my strokes. So instead of following just the volume of the object, I would shift and try, like you see in this video right now, and try and use different directions of strokes to show how the texture of the object isn't smooth, basically. I would still use layers of straight lines to show value, and layers of curved lines to show volume and form, but I would often have them as a first layer, and then on top of that I would add a layer of random strokes to show texture. And quickly to finish, I'll talk about the few things I probably would have done differently or will do differently the next time I do some cross-hatching work. And that would be that I probably would have taken more time on each line because of my time limit for Inktober. Obviously I didn't have as much, I couldn't really take all the time I wanted for each drawing because I needed to get them out so quickly. But in the future, I'd like to be able to focus on my parallel lines more, basically, and actually analyze the shadows a bit more, and just make sure that it's all clean and crisp. And I also probably would quite like to use something that allows me to use the whole line thickness thing a bit more. So probably dip pens or brush pens in the future. I'll try and use those more to experiment with that kind of line weight technique a bit more in depth. And I think that's it mostly for this little inking tutorial. Again, this technique was a first for me, so I learned a lot by experimenting and trial and error. And I personally feel like hatching actually requires a certain knowledge of light and perspective and anatomy, as it needs a lot more analysing and precision when you put the line down, a bit more than painting might, for example. This technique taught me a lot, actually, both technically and about what knowledge I was lacking. And I'll definitely give it another try once I feel a bit more confident with my sketching and anatomy. It's really good to pinpoint exactly what you're lacking, what you're not sure about, because you can't get away with broad strokes. It's all very precise, and so I thought it was character building, let's say. And I said in the beginning that I hadn't watched any tutorials before I ventured into Inktober, but I forgot to mention that I did analyse the work of artists who are very proficient at that kind of hatching work, because I'm a firm believer in learning from others' techniques and watching their work. So I'll link to a few of those fantastic artists in the description below if you want to check out their work and learn from how they do it all. And that's it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed this little tutorial. Let me know if it was any kind of helpful to you in the comments. I'd love to hear. I'm sorry it took me so long to put together. Tutorials are always a bit more complicated for me to put together than normal videos, but I hope the wait was worth it. As always, I'm going to say a big thank you for all of you for joining me for this video. I hope I'll see you next week for the next one. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Take really good care of yourselves, and I see you very soon. Bye everyone.